London, 1815. They say that love conquers all. What they don't tell you is that sometimes love must first survive betrayal, humiliation, and the suffocating weight of society's expectations. I, Catherine Ashford, never imagined that a single evening at the Harrington banquet would shatter the illusion of my marriage so completely, that my husband's cruelty would be laid bare before London's elite, that a whisper on a moonlit terrace would reawaken a love I had buried in the deepest chambers of my heart. But what I really didn't know is that true love requires not just passion, but courage, the courage to choose yourself when the world demands your silence. This is the story of a woman who discovered that dignity cannot be stripped away by a faithless husband, only surrendered by one's own hand, and who found that the greatest scandal of all is not in claiming your happiness, but in denying it. But before we dive into this story that challenged the very foundations of Regency Society's marriage conventions, tell me, from what corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. Truth is always more fascinating than fiction. I have always believed that there exists a particular quality of silence that precedes disaster, a breathless, anticipatory hush that settles over one's soul moments before everything changes. I experienced such a silence on the evening of the Harrington banquet, though in my naivete, I mistook it for the flutter of nervous excitement that accompanied any grand social event. The Harrington residence blazed with light. That April evening, every window ablaze with the glow of 1,000 candles, the music from the string quartet drifting through the open doors like a siren's call to London's most distinguished society. I had dressed with particular care, selecting a gown of midnight blue silk that my modista had assured me was the very height of fashion, with delicate silver embroidery at the hem that caught the light with each movement. My lady's maid, dear Agnes, had arranged my dark hair in an elaborate style that had taken the better part of an hour, weaving small diamonds throughout the curls. I had hoped, oh, how desperately I had hoped, that Edmund might look at me that evening and remember the woman he had courted just 6 months prior, the woman to whom he had recited poetry in the Ashford gardens, whose hand he had held with such tender attention during our chaperoned walks, whose opinions he had once solicited on matters ranging from literature to politics, with what I had believed was genuine interest. How thoroughly I had deceived myself. Edmund had been distant since our wedding night, a coldness settling over him like winter frost that I had attributed to the natural adjustment period of marriage. My mother had warned me that husbands often became less attentive once the chase was concluded, that a wife's duty was to maintain her grace and dignity regardless of her husband's moods. I had clung to this advice like a drowning woman to driftwood, convincing myself that his indifference was merely temporary, that the man I had married would eventually resurface. The carriage ride to the Harrington estate should have alerted me to the evening's trajectory. Edmund sat across from me in the darkness, his face illuminated only by the passing street lamps, and he did not speak a single word, not a comment about my appearance, not an inquiry about my day, not even the perfunctory observations about weather or society that typically comprised our limited conversations. He simply stared out the window, his jaw set in a manner that suggested his thoughts were miles away, or perhaps, as I would soon discover, focused on someone else entirely. We arrived fashionably late, as was expected of our station, and I felt the familiar anxiety that accompanied entering a ballroom full of society's most critical eyes. Yet I held my head high as Edmund offered his arm, a gesture so mechanical it might have been performed by an automaton, and we ascended the marble steps together. The ballroom was a vision of elegance, with towering arrangements of white roses and trailing ivy adorning every available surface, the crystal chandeliers sending prisms of light dancing across the polished floor. Ladies in their finest gowns moved like exotic birds through the crowd, their fans fluttering in the warm air as they exchanged gossip behind gloved hands. Gentlemen gathered in clusters, discussing politics and business, and the eternal question of which young lady would secure the most advantageous match of the season. Edmund released my arm the moment we crossed the threshold, and I felt the first whisper of unease flutter in my chest. Before I could question this abandonment, he had moved away, his attention captured by a group near the far windows, and I understood with sudden, nauseating clarity exactly what, or rather, who, had so completely commanded his focus. Miss Arabella Winters stood in the center of a circle of admirers like a golden goddess descended to earth for the express purpose of tormenting mortal women. Her hair was the color of spun honey, her complexion that enviable porcelain that suggested she had never once suffered the indignity of a freckle or blemish. Her gown was white silk with gold accents, perfectly suited to enhance her angelic coloring, cut in a style that walked the razor's edge between fashionable and scandalous, and Edmund moved toward her like a compass needle finding true north. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hands clutching my reticule with enough force to leave marks on my palms, watching as my husband, approached this woman with more animation in his expression than I had witnessed in our entire 5 months of marriage. She turned as he neared, and the smile that illuminated her face was both dazzling and damning. There was an intimacy in that smile, a knowledge that spoke of shared secrets and private moments that had no business existing between a married man and an unmarried lady. Lady Pemberton materialized at my elbow with the supernatural timing of a woman who could scent scandal like a bloodhound tracks prey. She had been a friend of my mother's, though I use the term friend loosely. Their relationship seemed predicated more on the exchange of gossip than genuine affection. Her words dripped with false sympathy, as she informed me that dear Edmund and Miss Winters had been seen together quite frequently at various social functions, that their connection had been the subject of much speculation, that everyone had assumed I must certainly be aware of the situation. The way she spoke, with that peculiar blend of concern and satisfaction, made it clear that she took a certain pleasure in being the bearer of such devastating news. I managed to maintain my composure, responding that I was quite aware of my husband's acquaintances and saw nothing remarkable in his conversing with other members of society. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but pride demanded I not provide additional fodder for the gossip mills. Lady Pemberton looked disappointed at my lack of visible distress, patted my arm with false comfort, and drifted away to find a more satisfying audience for her revelations. The evening deteriorated from merely uncomfortable to actively humiliating with each passing hour. Edmund remained perpetually at Miss Winters' side, his hand hovering at her elbow, leaning close to hear her whispered comments, laughing at her witticisms with genuine delight. They moved through the ballroom like a matched pair, so perfectly attuned to each other that one might be forgiven for assuming they were the married couple, not Edmund and I. I attempted to engage in conversation with various acquaintances, to present the image of a wife perfectly content with her circumstances, but I could feel the pitying glances following me like physical touches. The other ladies' smiles held that particular quality of sympathy mixed with superiority, grateful that they were not the ones suffering such public humiliation, while simultaneously judging me for not better controlling my husband's attentions. The true nadir of the evening came when I could no longer bear to watch from a distance, and approached where Edmund stood with Miss Winters and several other gentlemen. I thought perhaps the presence of his wife might remind him of propriety, might cause him to at least acknowledge my existence with some measure of courtesy. I was catastrophically wrong. Edmund's eyes slid over me with such casual dismissal that I might have been a servant interrupting her betters. When I attempted to join their conversation, commenting on the topic they had been discussing, a new opera that had recently opened, he cut across my words as though I had not spoken. He suggested, in a tone that carried clearly to everyone within hearing distance, that perhaps I might find amusement elsewhere, as the conversation had turned to matters of culture and refinement that required a certain level of sophistication to fully appreciate. The implication was devastatingly clear. I lacked the sophistication, the intelligence, the very worth to participate in discourse with him and his chosen companions. Miss Winters had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable, but she did not defend me, did not suggest that Edmund's behavior was inappropriate. The gentlemen shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to acknowledge the cut or pretend they had not witnessed it. I do not remember walking away. I have no recollection of navigating through the crowd, of finding the doors that led to the terrace, of stepping out into the cool April night. My body moved while my mind remained trapped in that moment of rejection, playing it over and over like a music box stuck on a single discordant note. The terrace was blessedly empty, the sounds of the ballroom muted by the heavy doors in the distance. I gripped the stone balustrade and gulped in air, fighting against the tears that threatened to spill down my carefully powdered cheeks. I would not cry. I would not give Edmund or Miss Winters or any of those pitying ladies the satisfaction of knowing they had broken me. But oh, how close I came to shattering entirely. The sound of footsteps on stone broke through my spiral of misery, and I tensed, preparing to present a composed face to whoever had followed me outside. I expected Lady Pemberton, eager to mine my distress for additional gossip, or perhaps one of the other ladies come to offer false comfort while secretly delighting in my downfall. Instead, a voice I had not heard in 2 years, a voice that had haunted my dreams and waking thoughts with equal persistence, spoke my name with such gentleness that it was very nearly my undoing. Alexander. Alexander Thornton, Duke of Greystone, stood in the doorway leading to the terrace, his tall frame backlit by the ballroom's golden glow. Even in silhouette, I would have known him. The breadth of his shoulders, the way he held himself with that particular combination of aristocratic bearing and genuine confidence that had always distinguished him from other men of his station. He moved toward me with careful steps, as though approaching a wounded creature that might bolt at any sudden movement. Perhaps that assessment was not far from the truth. I felt raw, exposed, my careful composure hanging by the most delicate of threads. The years had been kind to Alexander, or perhaps I simply had never truly looked at him objectively, my vision always colored by the complicated tangle of feelings I had worked so desperately to suppress. His dark hair was slightly longer than fashion dictated, giving him a somewhat roguish appearance that contrasted intriguingly with his formal evening attire. His eyes, gray as a winter storm, held an intensity that had always unsettled me, as though he could see past all the careful walls I had constructed around my heart. He did not immediately speak, and I was grateful for this small mercy. Instead, he removed his evening coat and draped it around my shoulders. I had not realized I was shivering until I felt its warmth, and stood beside me at the balustrade, his gaze directed out toward the Harrington gardens, rather than at my likely tear-streaked face. We remained thus for several minutes, the silence between us somehow more comfortable than any conversation I had shared with Edmund in months. Alexander had always possessed this quality, I reflected, the ability to simply be present without filling every moment with unnecessary words. It was one of the things I had loved about him, before I had convinced myself that such love was too dangerous, too intense, too likely to consume me entirely if I allowed it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and carefully controlled, though I detected a thread of anger running beneath the surface. Anger that was not directed at me, I sensed, but rather at what he had witnessed inside. He told me he had only just returned to London the previous week, that he had been managing his estates in Scotland, and had not planned to attend the season's social events. But Lord Harrington was an old friend, and he had been prevailed upon to make an appearance at the banquet. He had not known I would be present, had not known, in fact, that I was in London at all, having assumed I might be residing at my husband's country estate. The word husband seemed to cause him physical discomfort, his jaw tightening as he spoke it. He had seen me enter, he continued, had watched the evening's events unfold with growing fury. He confessed that he had nearly intervened multiple times, had been on the verge of causing a scene that would have set all of London society ablaze with scandal, but had restrained himself because he had not known if his interference would be welcome or would only cause me further distress. It was only when I had fled to the terrace that he had allowed himself to follow, unable to bear the sight of my obvious pain a moment longer. I found myself telling him things I had not admitted even to myself, how isolated I had felt in my marriage, how Edmund's coldness had gradually eroded my confidence, how I had tried so desperately to be the wife he wanted while losing sight of who I actually was. The words poured from me like water from a broken dam, and Alexander listened without interruption, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of my emotions. When I finally fell silent, exhausted by my own confessions, Alexander turned to face me fully. The moonlight cast shadows across his features, making him appear both familiar and mysterious, like a dream half remembered upon waking. What he said next would replay in my mind countless times in the weeks to come, each word etched into my memory with perfect clarity. He told me that he had loved me since the moment we met at Lady Morrison's musical 3 years prior, when I had been just out of my first season, and he had been preparing to take up his duties as Duke following his father's death. He had loved the way I laughed at his observations about society's absurdities, the intelligence that sparkled in my eyes when we debated literature and philosophy, the kindness I showed to those beneath our social station. He had courted me, he said, as much as propriety allowed, had believed, perhaps foolishly, that I returned his regard. But then Edmund Ashford had appeared, offering stability and an easy courtship that did not demand the intensity of feeling that Alexander represented. And when I had accepted Edmund's proposal, Alexander had fled to Scotland rather than remain in London and watch me marry another man. He had been a coward, he told me, his voice rough with self-recrimination. He should have spoken plainly of his feelings, should have fought for me rather than assuming I understood the depths of his regard. He had failed me through his own inability to voice what his heart had screamed with every beat, but he was done being a coward. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something uniquely him, close enough that I could see the silver flecks in his gray eyes, the slight scar on his left eyebrow that he had acquired in a childhood riding accident. His words, when they came, were spoken with such quiet conviction that they seemed to resonate in my very bones. He told me that I was always his, and he was always mine, that we both knew this truth, had always known it, even when we lacked the courage to claim it, that the connection between us was not something that could be dismissed or ignored or willed away through marriage vows spoken to another man. He was not asking me to betray my vows, he clarified, his honor too deeply ingrained to make such a request. But he needed me to know, needed me to understand, that what existed between us was real, was powerful, and deserved to be acknowledged even if it could never be acted upon. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so violently I was certain he must hear it. Every carefully constructed rationalization I had built around my marriage, every argument I had used to convince myself that choosing Edmund over Alexander had been the sensible, mature decision, crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame. Because he was right. I had always been his, and he had always been mine, and no amount of social expectation or fear or desire for security could change that fundamental truth. The sound of the terrace doors opening shattered the moment like glass striking stone. A group of young ladies emerged, laughing and chattering, seeking relief from the ballroom's heat. Alexander stepped back immediately, restoring the proper distance between us, though his eyes remained locked on mine with an intensity that made breathing difficult. I returned his coat, though my hands trembled as I did so. He accepted it with a slight bow, the gesture formal and correct, and utterly at odds with the earth-shattering conversation we had just shared. He asked if I would be well, if I needed his escort back inside. I assured him I would be perfectly fine, that I simply needed another moment of air before rejoining the festivities. The lie was transparent, but he accepted it gracefully, understanding that I needed time to process everything that had transpired. Before he departed, he said one final thing, that he would be remaining in London for the season, that should I ever need anything at all, I need only send word, and he would come. The promise carried weight beyond its simple words, an offer of protection and support that I had not realized I so desperately needed. When I finally returned to the ballroom, Edmund was nowhere to be seen. A discreet inquiry revealed that he had departed with several other gentlemen to one of the clubs, leaving me to find my own transportation home. The abandonment was not surprising. Indeed, it barely registered against the magnitude of everything else the evening had revealed. Lady Harrington, bless her, pretended not to notice my husband's absence, and arranged for her own carriage to convey me home. She said nothing about the tear stains I knew must be visible on my face, or the fact that I sat rigid and silent throughout the journey, my mind replaying every word Alexander had spoken. I was always his, and he was always mine. The truth of it terrified me, thrilled me, and changed everything I thought I knew about my life and my future. I arrived at the Ashford townhouse to find it dark and empty, Edmund still absent at his club. Or perhaps, I thought with bitter clarity, he had gone to call upon Miss Winters under some pretext or another. I climbed the stairs to my bedchamber, allowed Agnes to help me out of my finery, and dismissed her before collapsing onto my bed still wearing my chemise and stockings. And there, in the privacy of my room with no witnesses to my weakness, I finally allowed myself to cry. I wept for the naive girl who had believed that security was preferable to passion, who had convinced herself that a comfortable marriage was more valuable than a consuming love. I wept for the months I had wasted trying to earn the affection of a man who had never truly wanted me. I wept for the dreams I had abandoned, and the future I had thought was lost forever. But somewhere beneath the tears, a small flame of something else began to burn, a spark of defiance, of hope, of the possibility that perhaps my story was not yet finished after all. Alexander had returned to London. He had declared his feelings with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And while I did not yet know what, if anything, could come of such a declaration, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I could no longer pretend that my marriage to Edmund Ashford was anything other than the magnificent mistake it had always been. The question was, what, if anything, I intended to do about it. The morning after the Harrington banquet arrived with the cruel brightness that seems designed specifically to mock one's misery. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in my bedroom curtains with aggressive cheerfulness, and I buried my face in my pillow, wishing I could remain in the darkness indefinitely. Agnes entered with my morning chocolate, her expression carefully neutral in the way of servants who knew far more about their employer's circumstances than was comfortable for anyone involved. She informed me that Mr. Ashford had not returned home the previous evening, though his valet had received word that he was perfectly well and would likely arrive sometime during the afternoon. The information should have alarmed me, or at least provoked some response beyond the hollow numbness that had settled in my chest. Instead, I merely nodded and accepted the cup of chocolate, sipping it without tasting anything at all. Once Agnes had departed, I allowed myself to sink into the dangerous territory of memory, specifically, memories of Alexander Thornton and the 3 months during my first season when I had believed, with the foolish certainty of youth, that he might be my future. I had been 18, fresh from my presentation at court, dazzled by the whirlwind of balls and soirees and the intoxicating attention that came with being a new face in society. My mother had been determined that I make an excellent match, though her definition of excellent had far more to do with title and fortune than with any softer considerations like compatibility or affection. Alexander had not been on her approved list of potential suitors, which seemed absurd given that he was a duke, one of the highest-ranking noblemen in all of England. But my mother had heard rumors about the Greystone estates, whispers that they were heavily encumbered with debt from the previous duke's gambling habits, that Alexander would need to marry an heiress to restore the family fortunes. I was not an heiress. My dowry was respectable, but modest, suitable for attracting a well-situated gentleman, but hardly the kind of fortune that could rescue a ducal estate from financial ruin. Therefore, my mother had reasoned with her particular brand of ruthless practicality. Any interest the Duke might show in me was either frivolous flirtation, or worse, a deliberate attempt to compromise me into marriage regardless of his financial unsuitability. I had not cared about any of that when Alexander first approached me at Lady Morrison's musicale. The event had been dreadfully dull, as most musicals were, an endless parade of young ladies with varying degrees of talent, performing pieces designed more to showcase their accomplishments than to provide actual entertainment. I had been seated near the back of the drawing room, half listening to a particularly torturous rendition of a Mozart sonata, when a voice beside me had whispered an observation so perfectly, capturing my own thoughts, that I had laughed aloud before I could stop myself. The comment had been something about how the young lady's interpretation suggested Mozart had intended his work to be performed at half speed, with twice the dramatic emphasis, transforming a delicate composition into something resembling a funeral dirge for a particularly melodramatic tragedy. I had turned to find a gentleman I did not recognize, tall, dark-haired, with eyes that held genuine amusement, rather than the practiced charm most men deployed at social functions. He had introduced himself simply as Alexander Thornton, without immediately trumpeting his title, and had proceeded to keep up a steady stream of whispered commentary throughout the remainder of the music hall that had made the evening infinitely more bearable. Afterward, he had sought me out during the informal gathering that followed, and we had fallen into conversation with an ease that I had never experienced with anyone else. We discussed literature. He was partial to Byron's poetry while I preferred Wordsworth, and we had debated the merits of romantic versus classical sensibilities with genuine passion. We talked about art, about politics, about the absurdities of social conventions and the obligations of privilege, and 100 other topics that my other suitors never seemed interested in exploring. He had called upon me the next day, properly chaperoned and entirely respectable, and had continued to do so with gratifying regularity over the following weeks. We rode together in Hyde Park, attended the same balls and parties, partnered each other for dances whenever propriety allowed. He brought me books he thought I might enjoy, discussed the ideas within them with an intellectual engagement that made me feel seen in a way I had never experienced. My mother had grown increasingly concerned as Alexander's attentions continued. She had made inquiries about his financial situation and discovered that while the rumors of debt were exaggerated, the Greystone estates were not in dire straits. They were not as prosperous as they had been in previous generations. Alexander would certainly benefit from marrying wealth, even if he was not in desperate need of it. She had sat me down one afternoon and explained, with the patient condescension one might use with a particularly dim child, that while the Duke's attentions were flattering, I must not allow myself to develop expectations. Men of his rank often engaged in flirtations with pretty girls during the season without any serious intentions. I was to enjoy his company, but guard my heart, and under no circumstances was I to reject other, more suitable suitors in the hope that Alexander's interest might develop into something more permanent. I had nodded and agreed, and privately believed that my mother was wrong, that what Alexander and I shared was different, was real, was building towards something that would end with a proposal and a future together. But as the weeks passed, Alexander never spoke of his feelings in explicit terms. He was attentive, certainly, devoted even, but he never declared himself, never gave any indication that his intentions extended beyond enjoying my company during the season. And slowly, insidiously, doubt began to creep into my heart. What if my mother was right? What if I was merely an amusing diversion for a duke who would eventually need to marry someone of greater fortune or more impressive connections? What if I was foolishly spinning fantasies around what was, to him, merely a pleasant friendship? The doubt was amplified by the subtle pressure from every direction. My mother's increasingly pointed observations about other gentlemen who were showing interest. The comments from other ladies about how the Duke had been seen conversing with Miss Letitia Weatherby, who happened to be the daughter of one of England's wealthiest merchants. The knowing looks when Alexander would dance with me, looks that suggested everyone else could see that I was developing an unfortunate tendre for a man who was simply being kind to an agreeable young woman. And then Edmund Ashford had appeared, and I had made the worst decision of my life. Edmund was everything my mother had hoped for. A gentleman of good family, comfortable fortune, and stable prospects. He was handsome in a conventional way, with fair hair and blue eyes, and features that would have looked perfectly at home on a Greek statue. He was polite, proper, and his courtship was exactly what society deemed appropriate. He called upon me with regularity, brought me flowers, made polite conversation about acceptable topics, and never once challenged me intellectually or emotionally. There was no spark, no electricity, none of the intensity that characterized my interactions with Alexander. But there was also no uncertainty, no doubt, no fear that I was building castles in the air. When Edmund proposed after a courtship of precisely 6 weeks, the minimum period society deemed acceptable, my mother had been overjoyed, and I, exhausted by the emotional uncertainty of wondering whether Alexander would ever declare himself, had accepted. I told myself it was the mature, sensible decision. That passion was overrated and companionship was what truly mattered in a marriage. That security and stability were more important than the dangerous thrill I felt whenever Alexander entered a room. That I was being practical, rather than cowardly. I had been wrong about all of it. Alexander had heard of my engagement before I could summon the courage to tell him myself. News traveled with remarkable speed through London society. He had come to call one final time, and I remembered with painful clarity the look in his eyes when he had congratulated me on my upcoming nuptials. He had been unfailingly polite, everything a gentleman should be when acknowledging a lady's engagement to another man. But there had been something beneath the surface, a question in his gaze that I had refused to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have meant confronting my own doubts about the choice I had made. He had asked if I was certain, if this was truly what I wanted, and I, terrified of what might happen if I admitted the truth, had assured him that I was very happy, that Mr. Ashford was everything I could wish for in a husband, that I was looking forward to our future together. The lies had tasted like ashes on my tongue, but I had spoken them with a bright smile and a tone that brooked no doubt. Alexander had accepted my words at face value, or at least he had pretended to. He had wished me every happiness, had kissed my hand in farewell with lingering warmth, and had departed. Within a week, I learned that he had left London entirely, retreating to his Scottish estates on some matter of urgent business. I had told myself his departure was merely coincidental, that it had nothing to do with my engagement, but some part of me had known the truth even then. Alexander had left because remaining in London and watching me marry Edmund would have been unbearable, and I had let him go without a word, without acknowledging what we had both felt, because I had convinced myself that security was more valuable than love. My wedding to Edmund had been everything such an event should be. A beautiful ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square, attended by all the proper people, followed by an elegant breakfast and all the appropriate rituals. I had worn my mother's lace veil and carried white roses and smiled until my face ached, and through it all, I had felt as though I were watching someone else's life unfold, while my own true self remained locked away somewhere deep inside. The wedding night had been perfunctory. Edmund had performed his husbandly duties with all the enthusiasm one might bring to reviewing quarterly accounts, and afterward, he had retreated to his own chamber without a word of affection or tenderness. I had lain awake in the darkness of my new bedchamber and wondered if this was truly all that marriage entailed. This hollow coupling without intimacy, this sharing of a name and a home without any genuine sharing of hearts. The subsequent months had only confirmed my fears. Edmund was not cruel exactly. He did not raise his voice or his hand, did not gamble away our fortune or engage in obviously scandalous behavior, but he was absent in all the ways that mattered. He took no interest in my thoughts or feelings, showed no curiosity about who I was beyond my function as his wife, and gradually, I understood that he had never truly wanted me at all. He had wanted a wife in the same way one might want appropriate furniture for one's home, something suitable and decorative that fulfilled its function without requiring any actual engagement. I was a box to be checked on the list of things a gentleman of his station required: title, property, appropriate marriage, nothing more. And now, lying in my bed the morning after the Harrington banquet, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what I had known in my heart from the moment I accepted Edmund's proposal. I had made a catastrophic mistake. I had chosen safety over love, security over passion, and in doing so, I had condemned myself to a life of quiet desperation. I had let Alexander go because I had been too afraid to reach for what my heart truly wanted, too convinced that such intensity of feeling was dangerous rather than precious. But Alexander had returned to London. He had found me on that terrace and had spoken the words I had longed to hear 3 years ago, that I was his, and he was mine, and what existed between us was real and powerful and undeniable. The question now was, what, if anything, I could do about it. I was a married woman, bound by vows that society deemed unbreakable regardless of how thoroughly my husband trampled upon them. Edmund's affair with Miss Winters, for I no longer had any doubt that it was indeed an affair, might be conducted openly enough to provoke gossip, but it was not grounds for any action on my part. Wives were expected to endure such indignities with grace and dignity, to maintain the appearance of marital harmony, regardless of the reality behind closed doors. The thought of continuing in this manner for the rest of my life, watching Edmund pursue other women, living as a ghost in my own home, never again experiencing the kind of connection I had shared with Alexander, filled me with a despair so profound it was almost physical. But what alternative existed? Divorce was scandalous, shameful, and notoriously difficult to obtain. It would ruin my reputation entirely, mark me as fallen in the eyes of society, and leave me with neither home nor prospects. And while Alexander had declared his feelings, he had not actually proposed any course of action, had not suggested that he intended to pursue anything beyond acknowledging what existed between us. Perhaps, I thought with weary cynicism, he simply wanted me to know that I had made the wrong choice, that I could have had his love but had thrown it away for Edmund's hollow security. Perhaps it was revenge rather than renewed courtship, a way of ensuring I spent the rest of my life knowing exactly what I had lost. No, I rejected that thought immediately. Whatever Alexander's faults might be, deliberate cruelty was not among them. When he had spoken on that terrace, it had been with genuine emotion, with a vulnerability that suggested he was as overwhelmed by our reunion as I was. But knowing that he cared, knowing that he had always cared, did not actually solve any of my problems. I was still married to Edmund. I was still trapped in a life that felt more like a beautiful prison than a home, and I still had no clear path forward that did not involve either accepting my circumstances or courting complete social ruin. I rose from my bed finally, when remaining there any longer began to feel like cowardice, and allowed Agnes to help me dress. I selected a morning gown of pale green muslin, something simple and comfortable that required no particular effort, and went down to the breakfast room hoping that Edmund might have returned. and that we might have some necessary conversation about the previous evening. The breakfast room was empty save for the array of covered dishes on the sideboard. I helped myself to toast and tea. My stomach was too unsettled for anything more substantial, and sat alone at the long table, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight. It was in moments like these that the full reality of my situation became impossible to ignore. I had a husband in name only, a home that did not feel like mine, a life that seemed to be happening to someone else while my true self remained locked away, growing smaller and quieter with each passing day. The sound of the front door opening brought me out of my reverie. I heard Edmund's voice in the entrance hall, speaking with our butler, and then his footsteps approaching the breakfast room. I straightened in my chair, preparing myself for whatever conversation might follow, though I had no clear idea what I intended to say. Edmund entered, looking none the worse for his night away. His clothing was slightly rumpled, suggesting he had not changed, but otherwise he appeared perfectly composed. He helped himself to food from the sideboard, sat down across from me at the table, and proceeded to eat without acknowledging my presence beyond the briefest nod. The silence stretched between us, and I found myself caught between fury and despair. This man was my husband, the person with whom I was supposed to share my life, and yet we sat across from each other like strangers who happened to be sharing a coach, aware of each other's existence but with no genuine connection whatsoever. I thought of Alexander's words on the terrace, of the intensity in his eyes when he had told me I was always his. I thought of the years I had wasted convincing myself that this hollow marriage was acceptable, that this was simply what matrimony entailed for most people. And I realized, with sudden and perfect clarity, that I could not continue this way. Something had to change, even if I did not yet know what form that change might take. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I needed to know the full extent of Edmund's attachment to Miss Winters, needed to determine whether my marriage was merely cold or completely beyond salvaging. So I did something I had never done before. I directly challenged my husband about his behavior. The words left my lips before I could reconsider their wisdom, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. I asked Edmund directly about Miss Winters, about the nature of their relationship, about why he had found it acceptable to abandon his wife at a social function, while he devoted himself entirely to another woman's company. The transformation in Edmund's expression was remarkable. The bland indifference that typically characterized his features shifted to something closer to irritation, as though I were a servant who had overstepped her bounds by questioning her master's actions. He set down his fork with deliberate precision and informed me, in a tone one might use to explain something painfully obvious to a particularly slow child, that his associations were his own concern, and that I would do well to remember my place as his wife, which apparently meant maintaining a gracious silence regardless of his behavior. He continued, warming to his theme with an eloquence I had never witnessed him direct toward any topic involving me, that Miss Winters was a woman of remarkable refinement and intelligence, that their conversations provided him with intellectual stimulation that he found sadly lacking in his own home, and that if I took issue with his seeking companionship elsewhere, perhaps I should consider what deficiencies in my own character had driven him to do so. The cruelty of the words was breathtaking in its casualness. He spoke them without apparent malice, merely as statements of fact, observations about my inadequacies that he seemed to believe I should simply accept. And perhaps, I thought with bitter clarity, he genuinely did not understand that he was being cruel. Perhaps he truly believed that wives existed solely to manage households and provide heirs, and that expecting anything resembling partnership or affection was unreasonable on my part. I rose from the table with what dignity I could muster, informed him that I had social calls to make, and departed the breakfast room before the tears burning behind my eyes could betray the depth of his words' impact. I heard him return to his meal as I left, apparently satisfied that the matter was settled and required no further discussion. Agnes found me in my chamber some minutes later, my carefully maintained composure having finally cracked the moment I was alone. She said nothing, simply held me while I wept, and when the storm had passed, she helped me repair my appearance and prepare for the day ahead. I had not actually planned any social calls, but the lie had served its purpose of extracting me from Edmund's presence. However, the thought of remaining in the house all day, knowing he was somewhere within the same walls, felt intolerable. So I decided to make my fabrication truth and venture out into London, even if I had no particular destination in mind. The streets of Mayfair were busy with the usual morning traffic. Ladies in their carriages making calls, gentlemen on horseback heading to their clubs, servants rushing about on various errands. I walked with no clear direction, my maid trailing behind me at a respectful distance, simply allowing my feet to carry me away from the prison of my marriage and toward what? I had no answer to that question. It was perhaps inevitable that I found myself near the lending library in Piccadilly. I had always found solace in books when the real world became too difficult to bear. The establishment was quiet at this hour, most of society still engaged with breakfast or morning calls, and I welcomed the peaceful atmosphere as I entered. I was examining the shelves devoted to poetry, running my fingers along the spines of volumes I had read and loved, when a voice behind me made my heart stutter in my chest. Alexander stood near the entrance to the poetry section, a book in his hands, his expression suggesting he was as surprised by this encounter as I was. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, and I was acutely aware of every improper thought racing through my mind. Thoughts about how the morning light streaming through the windows brought out the silver in his gray eyes, about how his mere presence seemed to fill the entire space, about how desperately I wanted to close the distance between us and feel his arms around me. Instead, I managed a polite greeting, commenting on the coincidence of our both visiting the library at the same hour. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too bright and artificial, but it was the best I could manage when my entire body seemed to be vibrating with awareness of his proximity. He approached with careful slowness, maintaining perfect propriety, and showed me the book he carried, a volume of Wordsworth's poetry. He mentioned, with the ghost of a smile, that he had been thinking about our old debates regarding romantic versus classical sensibilities, and had decided to revisit the arguments in favor of the former, the reference to our past conversations, to those early days of our acquaintance when everything had seemed possible, hit me with unexpected force. I found myself blinking back tears, for the second time that morning, though for entirely different reasons than before. We fell into conversation as naturally as we had always done, discussing poetry and literature, as though 3 years had not passed, as though I had not married another man, as though the world had not irrevocably changed. And perhaps, in some way, it had not. Perhaps what existed between us truly was as immutable as Alexander had suggested, unaffected by time or circumstance or the barriers society had erected between us. When I mentioned that I had been thinking about Elizabeth Barrett's work, he immediately located a volume and handed it to me, his fingers brushing against mine in the transfer. The contact was brief, entirely accidental, and yet it sent warmth flooding through my entire body. I found myself wondering, with a mixture of shame and longing, what it would feel like to truly touch him, to have his hands on me without the constraints of propriety and marriage vows and social expectation. The impropriety of such thoughts should have scandalized me. Instead, they felt like the first genuine, honest thing I had experienced in months. We spent perhaps an hour in the library, ostensibly discussing literature, but actually engaging in the kind of deep, meaningful conversation I had not realized I was starving for. Alexander asked about my life, about whether I was happy, and I found myself being more honest than was wise, admitting that my marriage was not what I had hoped, that I felt increasingly isolated and invisible, that I was beginning to question every choice that had led me to this moment. He listened with complete attention, never interrupting, never offering platitudes or easy solutions. And when I finished speaking, he told me something that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. He said that he had been wrong to leave London after my engagement, wrong to assume that I had made my choice and that he had no right to question it. He should have fought for me, should have declared himself clearly and given me the option to choose him, rather than simply disappearing and leaving me to conclude that his interest had been merely casual. His words struck me like a physical blow. All this time, I had believed he had never truly cared, had convinced myself that my mother was right, and his attentions were merely friendly rather than romantic. And now he was telling me that he had loved me all along, that he had left, because watching me marry Edmund would have destroyed him, that every day since had been an exercise in living with the consequences of his own cowardice. I wanted to rage at him for not speaking sooner, for allowing me to make such a catastrophic mistake, for letting me believe I was imagining the connection between us. But I could not, because I bore equal responsibility for what had happened. I had been too afraid to ask, too convinced that love as intense as what I felt for him must be dangerous or unreliable, too willing to accept security over uncertainty. We had both been cowards, and we were both paying the price. Before we parted that day, propriety demanding we not remain together any longer without inviting speculation, Alexander made a request that was both innocent and deeply significant. He asked if I rode in Hyde Park, if I might consider joining him for a morning ride at some point. Properly chaperoned, of course, simply as old friends enjoying each other's company. The request was perfectly acceptable by society's standards. Married women could and did ride with male acquaintances, provided a groom or maid was present to maintain propriety. Yet we both understood that what he was truly asking was whether I was willing to continue these encounters, to allow this connection between us to develop despite the impossibility of our situation. I should have declined. I should have recognized the danger inherent in spending time with a man I had once loved, or rather, a man I had never stopped loving, though I had tried desperately to convince myself otherwise. I should have protected my reputation, my marriage vows, the careful facade of respectability I had maintained. Instead, I agreed to meet him in Hyde Park 3 mornings hence, at an hour when the fashionable crowds would be absent, and we might ride without excessive observation. The decision felt both terrifying and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff while simultaneously knowing it was the only direction I could possibly go. The following days passed in a strange state of suspended animation. Edmund continued his pattern of absence and indifference, spending his evenings at his club, or, I suspected, with Miss Winters. I maintained my household duties, responded to social invitations, smiled, and conversed as though nothing had changed in my world. But internally, I was counting down the hours until I would see Alexander again. I told myself that it was simply friendship, that there was nothing improper about riding with an old acquaintance, that I was making too much of what was merely a pleasant social engagement. Yet I took excessive care in selecting my riding habit, choosing a deep blue that I knew complemented my coloring, and allowed Agnes to arrange my hair in a style that was both practical for riding and becoming. The knowing look in my maid's eyes suggested she understood exactly what I was doing, and why, though she said nothing beyond commenting that the blue was indeed very flattering. I arrived at Hyde Park at the appointed hour to find Alexander already waiting, mounted on a magnificent gray gelding that matched his eyes. He had brought a gentle mare for me from his stables, explaining that he recalled my preference for horses with calm temperaments, rather than overly spirited ones. The fact that he remembered such a detail about me, that he had taken the care to select a mount specifically suited to my preferences, touched me more deeply than any grand gesture could have done. My maid remained at a discreet distance as we rode through the relatively empty paths, close enough to maintain propriety, but far enough to allow us private conversation. And oh, how we talked. We discussed everything and nothing, books we had read, observations about society, memories of our earlier acquaintance, carefully worded acknowledgments of feelings that could not be fully expressed. It was both exquisite pleasure and exquisite torture, being near him, speaking with him, feeling truly seen and understood for the first time in months, while simultaneously knowing that this was all we could ever have. Stolen moments of conversation, rides in the park, chance encounters at social functions, the intimacy of genuine connection without any possibility of the physical intimacy that my entire body seemed to crave whenever he was near. We established a pattern over the subsequent weeks. 3 mornings each week, we would meet in Hyde Park for rides that lasted an hour or slightly more. Alexander was unfailingly proper, never touching me beyond the necessary assistance mounting and dismounting, never saying anything that would cross the line from friendship into something more dangerous. Yet the very fact of these meetings, the regularity of them, the way I found myself living for those hours when I could be entirely myself with someone who truly understood me, suggested that we were already crossing lines that could not be uncrossed. Edmund, for his part, seemed entirely unconcerned with my activities. On the rare occasions when we occupied the same room, he never inquired about how I spent my time, never asked about my rides or my calls, or anything else regarding my life. His indifference should have wounded me. Indeed, it had wounded me deeply in the early months of our marriage. Now, however, I found myself grateful for it. His lack of interest provided me with freedom to pursue my friendship with Alexander, without the complications of a jealous or attentive husband. The irony was not lost on me. I had married Edmund seeking security and stability, and that very security, built on his complete disinterest in me as a person, was now providing me the space to develop a connection with the man I should have chosen in the first place. The weeks blurred together in a haze of stolen moments and growing attachment. Alexander and I expanded our encounters beyond morning rides. We discovered we both frequented the same lending library, attended the same lectures on art and poetry, somehow always managed to find ourselves at the same social functions despite the vastness of London's social calendar. Anyone paying close attention might have noticed the pattern, might have begun to whisper about the frequency with which Mrs. Edmund Ashford and the Duke of Greystone seemed to appear in the same locations. But society, for the most part, saw what it expected to see: a married woman and a gentleman of rank, engaging in perfectly proper social interactions. Nothing more. We were so very careful to maintain propriety, to never give anyone cause to question our conduct. And yet, with each conversation, each shared glance that lingered a moment too long, each accidental brush of hands when he helped me from my horse or handed me a book, I felt myself falling deeper into feelings that had never truly gone away. I was in love with Alexander Thornton. I had always been in love with him, and marriage to Edmund had not changed that fundamental truth. It had merely taught me to hide it from myself. But love without the possibility of fulfillment is perhaps the cruelest emotion of all. I could not be with Alexander, not truly. I was bound to Edmund by vows that society deemed unbreakable, and while Edmund might be conducting an affair with Miss Winters, of this I was now certain, having seen them together at multiple functions with a blatancy that suggested neither much cared who knew, his transgressions did not release me from my obligations. The double standard was galling. Edmund could parade his mistress through society with relative impunity, facing nothing worse than mild gossip and knowing smiles. But if I were to act on my feelings for Alexander, if we were to cross the line from friendship into something more, I would be ruined entirely. My reputation would be destroyed, my family disgraced, my future reduced to exile from everything and everyone I had ever known. It was deeply unfair, profoundly unjust, and absolutely the reality I lived within. Yet despite knowing all of this, despite understanding the impossibility of our situation, I could not bring myself to end our friendship. The hours I spent with Alexander were the only times I felt truly alive, truly myself. He reminded me of who I had been before my marriage had begun slowly erasing me, a woman of intelligence and wit and passion, not merely a decorative wife whose feelings and thoughts were of no consequence. And so I continued meeting him, continued allowing this connection to deepen, continued walking a razor's edge between propriety and scandal, while telling myself that as long as we did nothing overtly wrong, I was not truly betraying my marriage vows. I recognized with painful clarity, becoming exactly what society most feared and condemned, a woman whose heart belonged to someone other than her husband. The crisis, when it came, arrived not through any action on Alexander's part or mine, but through Edmund's own increasing carelessness regarding his affair with Miss Winters. The invitation to the Winterbourne ball arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the usual stack of correspondence that Agnes brought to my sitting room with my morning chocolate. I recognized Lady Winterbourne's distinctive handwriting immediately. She was known for her elaborate social events, and an invitation to one of her balls was considered among the season's most coveted. Under ordinary circumstances, I would have looked forward to such an event. Lady Winterbourne's entertainments were always elegantly executed, her guest lists carefully curated to include the most interesting members of society, rather than merely the most titled. Her balls featured exceptional music, creative refreshments, and an atmosphere that somehow managed to be both refined and genuinely enjoyable. However, as I read through the invitation's elegant script, a cold knot formed in my stomach. Lady Winterbourne was Miss Arabella Winter's aunt, her mother's sister, and this ball was being held specifically to celebrate Miss Winter's birthday. Edmund would undoubtedly attend. More than that, he would be expected to attend, as Miss Winters had made no secret of her particular friendship with my husband, and society had begun to speak of them in the knowing tones reserved for couples whose connection exceeded the bounds of propriety while somehow still remaining within the pale of acceptability. For a moment, I considered sending my regrets, claiming illness or some other convenient excuse. The thought of watching Edmund fawn over Miss Winters in a setting designed specifically to celebrate her was almost unbearable, but refusing would only fuel more gossip, would suggest that I was either unable to tolerate my husband's behavior or so weak as to flee from confrontation. Neither narrative was one I wished to propagate. So I accepted the invitation, writing a gracious note to Lady Winterbourne expressing my delight at attending, and tried not to think about the evening that awaited me in 3 weeks' time. I mentioned the ball to Alexander during one of our morning rides, attempting to maintain a casual tone, even as my hands tightened on the reins with barely suppressed anxiety. He listened quietly as I explained the situation, his expression growing increasingly dark as I detailed Edmund's likely behavior at an event designed to honor his paramour. When I finished, Alexander was silent for several moments, his jaw working as though he were physically restraining words that wanted to escape. Finally, he asked if I would be attending, and when I confirmed that I would, he simply nodded and said that he supposed he would attend as well. Lady Winterbourne's invitations were notoriously difficult to decline without causing offense, after all. The subtext was clear. He would be there, a silent support in what promised to be a difficult evening. I should have discouraged this, should have suggested that his presence might only complicate matters. Instead, I felt a rush of relief so profound it was almost physical. Whatever the evening held, I would not face it entirely alone. The 3 weeks preceding the ball passed with agonizing slowness. Edmund's absences from our home grew more frequent and prolonged, his rare appearances characterized by a distracted air that suggested his thoughts were perpetually elsewhere. On the few occasions when we were forced into conversation, he spoke with barely concealed impatience, as though my very existence was an inconvenience he was obliged to tolerate. I found myself wondering if Miss Winters made him happy in ways I never could, if perhaps he was actually capable of genuine feeling, and I had simply never been the person to inspire it in him. The thought was oddly painful, not because I still harbored any illusions about loving Edmund, but because it suggested that my failure to secure his affection was somehow personal, rather than a reflection of his general capacity for emotional connection. Alexander, during our increasingly frequent encounters, never spoke directly about Edmund or my marriage, but his anger on my behalf was palpable. I would catch him watching me with an expression that suggested he was restraining himself from saying things that could not be unsaid, from making offers that could not be accepted, from crossing lines that would irrevocably alter both our lives. The tension between us grew with each meeting, an electrical charge that seemed to fill the air whenever we were in proximity. I found myself hyper-aware of everything about him, the way he moved, the timbre of his voice, the rare smiles that transformed his typically serious expression into something that made my heart stutter in my chest. I was falling deeper into feelings that had nowhere to go, no possible resolution that did not end in either resignation or ruin. The evening of the Winterbourne ball arrived, with the inevitability of a storm, one watches approaching across distant hills. I dressed with particular care, selecting a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the green flecks in my hazel eyes. The bodice was cut daringly low, not scandalously so, but certainly enough to draw attention, and the fabric clung to my figure in ways that my usual modest choices did not. Agnes raised an eyebrow as she laced me into the gown, but said nothing beyond commenting that the color was exceptionally becoming. I understood what she was not saying. I was dressing not for my husband, but to remind society, and perhaps one particular duke, that I was worth noticing, worth valuing, worth more than the indifference with which Edmund treated me. It was petty, perhaps, but I found I did not particularly care. Edmund had left hours earlier, not bothering to wait for me or suggest we arrive together. The slight should have wounded me. Instead, I felt only relief at not being forced to endure his company during the carriage ride to the Winterbourne residence. I arrived alone, my entrance noted by the receiving line with expressions that ranged from sympathy to curiosity to barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing what promised to be an entertaining drama. Lady Winterbourne herself greeted me with genuine warmth. Whatever her niece's transgressions, she at least had the grace to treat me with courtesy, and welcomed me to the celebration. The ballroom was magnificent, decorated in shades of gold and white that reflected the candlelight in shimmering waves. The guest list appeared to include everyone of significance in London society, the crowd so dense that movement required careful navigation. An orchestra played from a raised platform, and couples already filled the dance floor, swirling in patterns that looked almost hypnotic from a distance. I located Edmund almost immediately. Not difficult, given that he stood in the center of a prominent group near the refreshment tables, and Miss Winters was at his side. She wore white, of course, the color of innocence and maidenhood, though the knowing looks they exchanged suggested she was neither. Her hand rested on Edmund's arm with casual possessiveness, and as I watched, He leaned down to whisper something that made her laugh with clear delight. The scene was almost identical to the Harrington banquet, except that here, in a ball held specifically to honor Miss Winters, Edmund's devotion to her was even more pronounced. He fetched her refreshments, secured her partners for dances, ensured she was always the center of an admiring circle. He performed all the attentions that a devoted suitor might show, or rather, that a devoted suitor should show, except that Edmund was not a suitor, but a married man whose wife stood across the room, watching her husband court another woman with a blatancy that bordered on deliberate cruelty. I felt the eyes on me, the whispers that followed in waves. Poor Mrs. Ashford, they would be saying. How humiliating for her. How shocking that Mr. Ashford shows so little discretion. One almost feels sorry for her. Though really, what kind of wife allows her husband such liberty? The blame somehow circled back to me, as it always did when men strayed. If Edmund preferred Miss Winters' company, it must be because I was somehow lacking, somehow insufficient, somehow failing in my wifely duties to keep his attention properly fixed. I stood frozen near the entrance, my hands clenched in my skirts, fighting the urge to simply flee back to my carriage and escape this nightmare. But pride held me in place. Damnable, stubborn pride that refused to give Edmund or Miss Winters or any of these gossiping observers the satisfaction of seeing me retreat in defeat. It was in this moment, when I was balanced on the knife's edge between composure and collapse, that I felt a presence beside me and heard a voice that seemed to reach into my chest and steady my racing heart. Alexander had arrived, and he was looking at me with such focused intensity that the crowded ballroom seemed to fade into insignificance. He did not ask permission, did not engage in polite preliminaries. He simply extended his hand and told me, in a tone that brooked no refusal, that this dance was his. The orchestra had just begun a waltz, that scandalous dance that society had only recently deemed acceptable, and even then with reservations about its propriety. To waltz required a level of physical proximity that other dances did not, the gentleman's hand at the lady's waist, their bodies moving in synchronization in a manner that some still considered dangerously intimate. I placed my hand in Alexander's without hesitation, without thought for what this might signal to the watching crowd. He led me onto the dance floor with a possessiveness that was unmistakable, his hand at my waist burning through the silk of my gown like a brand. We began to move, and I forgot everything else. Forgot Edmund and Miss Winters, forgot the gossiping observers, forgot propriety and marriage vows, and all the reasons this was inadvisable. There was only Alexander, his gray eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made breathing difficult, his hand guiding me through the steps with such perfect timing that we moved as one entity rather than two separate people. He spoke low enough that only I could hear, his voice rough with barely restrained emotion. He told me he had watched me standing alone, absorbing the humiliation Edmund was inflicting, and he could not bear it a moment longer. He told me that I deserved better than this, better than a husband who treated me with such casual cruelty, better than a society that blamed me for his failures, better than a life spent pretending that my feelings and needs were of no consequence. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I blinked them back furiously. I would not cry here, would not give anyone additional ammunition for their gossip. Alexander continued, his words coming faster now, as though a dam had broken and everything he had been holding back was flooding forth. He spoke of the torture of these past weeks, of watching me from a careful distance while knowing he could not truly have me, of the anger that consumed him every time he witnessed Edmund's indifference to what he possessed. He told me he had tried to be patient, to respect the boundaries my marriage imposed, to content himself with friendship when everything in him screamed for more. But watching Edmund parade his affair before all of London while I stood alone, bearing the weight of judgment that should have been directed at my faithless husband, had finally broken his restraint. And then, as we turned near the edge of the dance floor, he said the words that would change everything. He told me he loved me, that he had always loved me, from that first evening at Lady Morrison's music hall 3 years ago, that leaving London after my engagement had been the act of a coward, but remaining and watching me belong to another man would have destroyed him entirely, that every day since he had returned to London and found me again had been an exercise in restraint that grew more difficult with each passing hour. He was not asking me to betray my vows, he clarified, even as his hand tightened at my waist in a manner that suggested his body wanted precisely that. He was not suggesting we engage in an affair or do anything that would compromise my reputation, But he needed me to know, needed me to understand, that I was loved, deeply and completely, by someone who saw every part of me and valued it all, that I was his, as I had always been his, regardless of whose ring I wore or whose name I carried. The waltz ended, but we remained still for a moment longer than propriety allowed, caught in the intensity of what had just been spoken. Around us, I was dimly aware of the other dancers beginning to clear the floor, of the whispers that were certainly following in our wake, of the spectacle we had just provided to everyone watching. I did not care. Alexander had claimed me before all of London society with a possessiveness that left no room for misunderstanding. He had declared his love not in a private moment, but in the most public way possible, through a dance that everyone would be discussing tomorrow, in a manner that suggested he had staked a claim and dared anyone to challenge it. And I had allowed it, had welcomed it, had responded to his touch and his words with a transparency that made my feelings equally clear to anyone observing. We had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. Alexander escorted me from the dance floor with perfect propriety, his hand at my elbow in a manner that was entirely correct, and yet somehow conveyed ownership. He fetched me a glass of champagne, engaged me in conversation about innocuous topics, as though we had not just shaken the foundations of my world, and generally behaved like a perfect gentleman attending to a lady's comfort. But his eyes never left mine, and the message in them was unmistakable. Everything had changed, and we both knew it. I was aware, peripherally, that Edmund had witnessed our dance. He stood with Miss Winters, his expression thunderous in a way I had never seen before. Apparently, my husband, who showed no interest in my company, my thoughts, or my feelings, was not pleased to see another man paying me the attention he could not be bothered to provide. The hypocrisy would have been laughable if it were not so pathetic. Miss Winters looked less certain than I had ever seen her, her eyes darting between Edmund's furious face and where Alexander and I stood in clear view of the entire ballroom. Perhaps she was finally recognizing that openly conducting an affair with a married man might have consequences she had not fully considered. Or perhaps she was simply annoyed that attention had shifted from her birthday celebration to the drama of Mrs. Ashford and the Duke of Greystone. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. I danced with several other gentlemen. Propriety demanded I not spend the entire ball in Alexander's exclusive company, but I was aware of his presence at every moment, of his eyes tracking me across the ballroom, of the invisible thread that seemed to connect us regardless of physical distance. When it came time to depart, Edmund was nowhere to be found, likely having left with Miss Winters to continue their celebration in private. I should have felt humiliated by this abandonment. Instead, I felt only relief that I would not be forced to endure his company on the journey home. Alexander offered to see me to my carriage, and I accepted with a gratitude that went beyond the simple courtesy. As he handed me up into the vehicle, he held my hand a moment longer than necessary, and spoke words meant only for my ears. He told me that he understood my situation was impossible, that he was not asking me to make any immediate decisions or take any action that might damage my reputation, but he wanted me to know that when, not if, but when, I was ready to choose my own happiness over society's expectations, he would be waiting. That whatever the cost, whatever the scandal, he would stand beside me and face it together. The promise was both beautiful and terrifying, because it suggested he truly believed there was a path forward for us, some way to navigate the impossible tangle of my marriage and society's expectations, and the scandal that would surely follow if I chose him over Edmund. I wanted to believe him. God, how desperately I wanted to believe that happiness was possible, that I did not have to resign myself to a lifetime of quiet misery married to a man who cared nothing for me. But as my carriage pulled away from the Winterbourne residence, carrying me back toward the empty house that was supposed to be my home, I could not see how such a future could possibly exist. Society did not forgive wives who left their husbands, no matter how justified their reasons. The scandal would be absolute, the consequences severe. My family would be disgraced, my reputation destroyed, my future reduced to exile from everything I had ever known. Was love, even love as powerful as what I felt for Alexander, worth such a price? I did not know the answer to that question, but I knew with certainty that both thrilled and terrified me that I would soon be forced to decide. Because after tonight, after that waltz and Alexander's declaration, and the way he had claimed me before all of London, there could be no more pretending, no more careful friendship that maintained plausible deniability. No more hiding from the truth that I loved a man I could not have and was trapped in a marriage to a man I could not love. Something would have to give. The only question was what form that breaking would take, and who would be left standing when the dust finally settled. I did not sleep that night. How could I, when my mind replayed every moment of the Winterbourne ball with relentless clarity? Alexander's hand at my waist, the intensity in his eyes as we waltzed, the words he had spoken that had simultaneously healed something broken inside me and shattered what remained of my carefully constructed composure. He loved me. He had always loved me, and he was offering me a future if I had the courage to reach for it. But what, precisely, did that future entail? The question tormented me as I lay in my bed watching the first gray light of dawn creep through my curtains. Society did not simply allow wives to leave their husbands and take up with other men, regardless of how poorly those husbands treated them. The path Alexander was suggesting, if he was indeed suggesting anything beyond acknowledging his feelings, would require navigating a labyrinth of social conventions, legal complications, and potential ruin. Edmund did not return home that night, or the following day, or the day after that. His continued absence should have alarmed me, but I found I was grateful for it. Grateful not to face his inevitable fury about the spectacle Alexander and I had created, grateful not to endure his hypocrisy about my behavior when his own was infinitely worse, grateful simply to exist in my own home without the oppressive weight of his indifference. The gossip, predictably, exploded. By the second morning after the ball, Lady Pemberton had called with the express purpose of informing me, with her particular blend of false concern and genuine relish, that all of London was discussing the Duke of Greystone's marked attentions to Mrs. Edmund Ashford at the Winterbourne ball. She settled herself in my drawing room like a general preparing for battle, her teacup held with delicate precision as she delivered her intelligence. The ton was positively abuzz, she informed me, with speculation about the nature of my relationship with the Duke. Some suggested it was merely friendship between old acquaintances, but others, here she paused for maximum effect, wondered if perhaps the Duke's attentions were rather more particular than propriety allowed. Of course, she continued with poisonous sweetness, she personally did not believe there was anything improper occurring, but one had to consider appearances, and the appearance of a married woman waltzing with such obvious intimacy with a gentleman who was not her husband, while that husband was clearly devoted to another woman, well, it created a certain impression that was difficult to dispel. I managed to maintain my composure throughout this recitation, responding with cool politeness that the Duke was indeed an old friend, that I saw nothing remarkable in sharing a dance with him, and that anyone who wished to speculate about impropriety in my conduct might consider directing their attention to those whose behavior actually warranted such scrutiny. The barb landed precisely as intended. Lady Pemberton's expression flickered with displeasure. She had hoped to provoke either tears or defensive explanations, not this calm redirection toward Edmund's far more egregious conduct. She finished her tea with obvious disappointment and departed shortly thereafter, no doubt eager to spread this latest development throughout her extensive network of gossips. After she left, I found myself pacing my drawing room with agitated energy. The walls of my home felt closer than usual, the air more suffocating. I had spent 5 months learning to exist within the confines of this marriage, teaching myself to accept Edmund's indifference and the loneliness of a union that was marriage in name only. But Alexander's reappearance had reminded me of what I had given up, what I had convinced myself I could live without. And now, having tasted genuine connection again, the thought of returning to that empty existence felt unbearable. Yet what alternative existed? The question circled endlessly in my mind, a maze with no apparent exit. Alexander called the following afternoon, observing all proper forms, arriving at an acceptable hour, sending his card up before being admitted, maintaining perfect courtesy when Agnes showed him into the drawing room where I waited with mounting anxiety about what this conversation might entail. He looked tired, I noticed, shadows beneath his eyes suggesting his sleep had been no more restful than mine, but his gray eyes held the same intensity they had at the ball, the same mixture of determination and tenderness that had so thoroughly undone me during our waltz. We observed the rituals of polite conversation for several minutes. Inquiries about health, comments about the weather, the kind of meaningless pleasantries that provided cover for what we both truly wanted to discuss. But eventually, the pretense became unbearable. and I found myself asking directly what he had meant at the ball, what he envisioned when he spoke of waiting for me, what possible future he thought we could have. Alexander was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped before him in an attitude that suggested he was choosing his words with great care. When he spoke, his voice was low and serious, and what he said altered the landscape of possibility in ways I had not dared imagine. He told me he had been making inquiries, discreet inquiries, through his solicitors, about the legal options available for unhappy marriages. Divorce was notoriously difficult and scandalous, it was true, but it was not impossible. And in cases where a husband's adultery could be proven, as Edmund's surely could, given the blatancy of his affair with Miss Winters, there were legal remedies available. More intriguingly, Alexander suggested, there was the possibility of an annulment under certain circumstances. If a marriage had not been properly consummated, if there were grounds to suggest the union had been entered into under false pretenses, the church could potentially declare it invalid from the start. I felt heat flood my cheeks at the implication. Discussing such intimate matters was hardly proper conversation between a lady and a gentleman, but Alexander's expression held no prurient interest, only serious intent, and a lawyer's attention to practical detail. He was not, he clarified, asking me to take any immediate action. He understood that the social consequences of ending my marriage would be severe, that I would face judgment and scandal regardless of how justified my reasons. He was simply informing me that options existed, that I was not as trapped as I might believe, that with careful planning and the right legal approach, there were paths forward that did not require me to remain in a marriage that was slowly destroying me. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. I had assumed that marriage was truly binding, that regardless of Edmund's behavior or my own unhappiness, I was irrevocably bound until death. But Alexander was suggesting otherwise, that the law, for all its inequities and difficulties, did provide some recourse for women in impossible situations. I asked him why he was telling me this, what he hoped I would do with this information. Did he expect me to simply leave Edmund, to court scandal and ruin for the possibility of a future with him? His response was careful, measured, and devastatingly honest. He told me he would never pressure me to make a choice that would harm me. If I decided that remaining with Edmund, maintaining my social position and avoiding scandal, was the wiser course, he would respect that decision and remove himself from London to spare me further difficulty. But if, and he stressed this was entirely my choice to make, if I decided that my own happiness, my own freedom, was worth the risk and the scandal, then he would stand beside me through every moment of it. He would provide financial support, legal assistance, protection from society's worst judgments. He would marry me the moment it became legally possible, giving me his name and his position to help shield me from the consequences of leaving Edmund. He was offering me everything, his love, his support, his social standing as a duke to help mitigate the scandal that would inevitably follow. But he was also being clear that the decision was mine alone to make, that he would not manipulate or coerce me, that whatever I chose would be honored. I found myself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was proposing. This was not some romantic fantasy of running away together. It was a careful, practical plan for navigating the legal and social complexities of ending one marriage and beginning another. Alexander had thought through the consequences, prepared for the difficulties, and was still willing to face them if I was. The question remained, was I willing? Was my happiness, my freedom, my chance at genuine love worth the price I would inevitably pay? The days following Alexander's visit became an exercise in internal warfare. My practical mind, the voice that sounded remarkably like my mother, catalogued all the reasons why leaving Edmund would be catastrophic. The scandal would be absolute. My family would be humiliated. I would lose access to most of society, be received in fewer and fewer homes, become one of those cautionary tales mothers whispered to their daughters about the consequences of putting passion above duty. But another voice, quieter but increasingly insistent, asked different questions. What was the value of social acceptance if it required living a lie? What was the point of maintaining appearances if the reality behind them was soul-crushing loneliness? How many more years of Edmund's indifference could I endure before there was nothing left of the woman I had once been? I began to observe my marriage with new eyes, cataloging the small cruelties and large absences that I had taught myself to accept as normal. Edmund's continued absence from our home, his blatant affair with Miss Winters that he no longer made any effort to conceal, the way he spoke to me, on those rare occasions when he spoke at all, with a contempt that suggested my very existence was an inconvenience. This was what I had chosen over Alexander. This hollow, empty mockery of marriage was what I had convinced myself was preferable to the intensity and uncertainty of genuine passion. The recognition of my own foolishness was bitter as poison. I continued my routines: morning rides with Alexander in Hyde Park, social calls, the endless rounds of activities that filled a lady's days. But I moved through it all with a sense of disconnection, as though I were watching myself from a distance, observing a woman going through the motions of a life while the real person inside screamed to break free. Alexander never pressed me for a decision. He maintained his patient, supportive presence, making it clear through his actions that he would wait as long as necessary for me to determine my own path. But I could see the tension in him, the restraint required to hold himself at friendship's distance when everything between us pulled toward something deeper. We were like two magnets being held forcibly apart, the air between us crackling with potential that could not be released without shattering the careful propriety we maintained. The crisis, when it came, arrived not through any action of mine, but through Edmund's own spectacular miscalculation. I learned of it from Agnes, who heard it from Edmund's valet, who had witnessed the entire scene firsthand. Apparently, Miss Winter's father, the Earl of Blackwood, a man known for his fierce protection of his family's reputation, had discovered the extent of his daughter's affair with my husband. The Earl had been under the impression that Edmund was merely one of many gentlemen who admired his daughter, that their connection was nothing more than the kind of flirtation young ladies engaged in during the season. But someone, and here the gossip varied depending on who was telling the story, had informed him of the true nature of their relationship, including details that suggested it had progressed far beyond what propriety allowed. The Earl had confronted Edmund at his club, in front of numerous witnesses. The particulars varied in the telling, but the essential facts were clear. The Earl had demanded that Edmund either cease his attentions to Miss Winters immediately, or face social and potentially legal consequences for compromising an unmarried lady of good family. Edmund, apparently incapable of recognizing when discretion was advised, had responded with outrage. He had declared, and here my hands trembled as Agnes recounted the words, that he cared nothing for the Earl's threats, that his marriage was a farce entered into out of obligation rather than inclination, and that if he could rid himself of his current wife, he would happily marry Miss Winters instead. The statement had circulated through London society with the speed of wildfire through dry brush. By evening, everyone who mattered knew that Edmund Ashford had publicly declared his marriage to me a farce, and expressed desire to be rid of me so he might marry his mistress. I should have been devastated. I should have been humiliated beyond bearing. Instead, I felt something entirely unexpected: relief, because Edmund had just handed me the weapon I needed to free myself from our marriage with far less scandal than I had imagined possible. Alexander arrived at my home within hours of the news breaking. Propriety be damned. His expression was thunderous as Agnes showed him into my drawing room, and I could see the barely restrained fury in every line of his body. Before he could speak, before he could launch into what I suspected would be a passionate denunciation of Edmund's behavior, I held up my hand to stop him. I told him, with a calmness that surprised even myself, that Edmund's public declaration had actually simplified matters considerably. If my husband wished to be rid of me so he could marry Miss Winters, then he would face far less opposition to an annulment than he might otherwise have encountered. The legal grounds might be thin, but with both parties willing, and Edmund's adultery well documented, it could potentially be managed with less scandal than a full divorce. Alexander stared at me for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether I was serious, or if shock had temporarily unbalanced my reason. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured, as though addressing something fragile that might shatter with rough handling. He asked if I truly meant what I was saying, if I was actually suggesting that I would pursue an annulment. Because if I was truly ready to take that step, then he would engage his solicitors immediately, would begin the process of legally separating me from Edmund Ashford in the manner that would cause the least possible damage to my reputation. I met his eyes and told him yes. I was done pretending that my marriage was anything other than the mistake it had always been. I was done sacrificing my happiness on the altar of social expectation. And I was done denying what had been true from the moment we met, that I loved him, had always loved him, and that no marriage vow spoken to another man could change that fundamental truth. The transformation in Alexander's expression was profound. The careful restraint he had maintained for weeks crumbled, replaced by an intensity that made breathing difficult. He moved toward me, stopping just short of proper distance, his hands flexing at his sides as though he wanted to reach for me, but was holding himself back through sheer force of will. He told me that I would not face this alone, that he would use every resource at his disposal to ensure the process was as painless as possible. He would speak with his solicitors immediately, would begin gathering evidence of Edmund's adultery, would work with the church and the courts to find the legal path that would free me with minimal scandal. And when it was done, when I was finally free of Edmund Ashford, he would marry me immediately, giving me his name and his protection, and his love for the rest of our lives. The promise was everything I had not dared to dream possible. But even in this moment of decision, even with the path forward finally clear, I understood that the journey would not be easy. Society would judge me harshly for ending my marriage, regardless of Edmund's provocations. There would be whispers, social exclusions, relationships that would never recover from the scandal. But as I looked at Alexander, at the love and determination in his eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that I could endure anything society might inflict if it meant spending my life with someone who actually valued me. I had chosen security once, and had learned that a beautiful cage was still a cage. Now I was choosing love, with all its risks and uncertainties, and trusting that it would be enough to see me through whatever challenges lay ahead. The impossible decision had been made. There was no going back now, only forward, into an unknown future that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. The morning after my decision, I woke with a clarity of purpose I had not experienced in years. The uncertainty that had plagued me for weeks had evaporated, replaced by a calm determination that felt almost foreign, after so many months of drifting passively through a life that did not feel like my own. Agnes entered with my morning chocolate, and immediately sensed the change in me. She had been my lady's maid since before my marriage, had witnessed the gradual dimming of my spirit over these past 5 months, and now she looked at me with something approaching relief, as though she too had been waiting for me to remember who I was, beneath the weight of Mrs. Edmund Ashford. I asked her to arrange for my morning ride in Hyde Park, knowing that Alexander would be there as he always was, waiting. But today would be different. Today, we would not be simply two people stealing moments of connection while pretending the barriers between us were insurmountable. Today, we would begin the actual work of dismantling those barriers, regardless of the cost. Alexander was already mounted when I arrived at the park, his gray gelding shifting impatiently beneath him. The moment he saw me, his entire demeanor changed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, though his eyes remained serious and intent. He helped me mount with hands that lingered a fraction longer than necessary, and we set off along the relatively empty paths, with my maid trailing at her usual discreet distance. Neither of us spoke for several minutes, though the silence between us held none of the awkwardness of uncertainty. Instead, it felt like the calm before a great undertaking, the moment when one takes a deep breath before plunging into cold water. Finally, Alexander told me that he had already set things in motion. He had met with his solicitors the previous evening, laying out the situation and requesting their most expert advice on how to proceed. What they had told him was simultaneously more hopeful and more complex than he had anticipated. An annulment, they had explained, required proving that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. This could be accomplished through several means, non-consummation being the most straightforward, though intensely private, and requiring testimony that no lady should be forced to provide publicly. However, there were other grounds that might be pursued: proof of coercion, evidence that one party had entered the marriage under false pretenses, or, and here Alexander's expression had grown particularly intent, mutual consent of both parties combined with documented adultery on the husband's part. The last option was the most promising, his solicitors had suggested. If Edmund could be convinced that an annulment was in his best interest, freeing him to marry Miss Winters without the stain of divorce, and if the evidence of his affair was sufficiently documented, the church might be persuaded to grant the annulment with minimal public scrutiny. It would still be scandal, certainly, but manageable scandal rather than the complete social ruin that typically accompanied the dissolution of a marriage. The key, Alexander explained, was securing Edmund's cooperation, and that was where the situation became delicate. I listened to all of this with a strange sense of detachment, as though we were discussing a legal matter that concerned someone else entirely, rather than the unraveling of my own marriage. But beneath the calm surface, my mind was racing with implications and possibilities. I asked Alexander what, specifically, his solicitors recommended as the next step. His response was both practical and surprisingly audacious. They suggested that Alexander approach Edmund directly, as one gentleman to another, with a proposal that would benefit all parties involved. The proposal would be simple. Alexander would provide extensive documentation of Edmund's affair with Miss Winters, evidence that, if made public, could seriously damage Edmund's reputation and potentially provoke the Earl of Blackwood to take legal action. However, rather than using this information to create scandal, Alexander would offer Edmund a solution. Agree to an annulment on grounds of mutual consent and documented incompatibility. Allow me to leave the marriage with a generous settlement that would preserve my reputation. And in return, Alexander would ensure that the evidence remained private and that Edmund would be free to marry Miss Winters without excessive scandal once an appropriate period had passed. It was, in essence, a negotiation, trading my freedom for Edmund's ability to pursue his affair without interference. And while the mercenary nature of such an arrangement should perhaps have offended me, I found instead that it made perfect sense. Edmund did not want me any more than I wanted him. If we could both secure what we actually desired while minimizing the damage to all parties, was that not preferable to a protracted legal battle that would satisfy no one? I told Alexander to proceed with his plan, to arrange a meeting with Edmund and present this proposal. The thought of the two men discussing my future as though negotiating a business transaction should have rankled. I was not property to be traded, after all. But in truth, this was the reality of marriage in our society. Women were always the subject of negotiations between men, whether we acknowledged it openly or maintained the pretense that we had agency in our own lives. At least in this case, the negotiation would result in my freedom, rather than my continued imprisonment. The meeting took place 3 days later, in Alexander's study at his London residence. I was not present. Such discussions were deemed unsuitable for female participation, despite the fact that my entire future hinged on their outcome. Instead, I waited at home in a state of anxious suspension, unable to focus on anything beyond the passage of time and the question of whether Edmund would accept the proposal or reject it out of spite. Alexander arrived at my home late that afternoon, and the expression on his face told me everything before he spoke a single word. The meeting had been successful, more successful, in fact, than he had dared hope. We retired to my drawing room, propriety maintained by the presence of Agnes, arranging flowers in the corner, though I suspected she was attending more to our conversation than to her task. Alexander settled into the chair across from me and began to recount what had transpired. Edmund had arrived at the appointed time, his demeanor defensive and hostile. He had clearly expected some form of confrontation, perhaps a challenge regarding his treatment of me or his affair with Miss Winters. Instead, Alexander had presented the situation as a problem requiring a mutually beneficial solution, the approach that had caught Edmund off guard in the best possible way. Alexander had been direct. He had extensive documentation of Edmund's affair with Miss Winters, including witness statements from servants, correspondence that had been carelessly left unsecured, and testimony from individuals who had observed them in compromising situations. This evidence could be used to pursue a divorce on grounds of adultery, but such a proceeding would be lengthy, expensive, and would damage everyone involved, including Miss Winters, whose reputation would be destroyed by the public airing of such details. Alternatively, Alexander had continued, they could pursue an annulment on grounds of mutual consent and incompatibility. Edmund would agree that the marriage had been a mistake, entered into without proper understanding of each party's expectations. I would be provided with a generous settlement, far more generous than I would receive in a divorce, that would allow me to maintain my independence and social position. And in return, Alexander would ensure that all evidence of Edmund's affair remained private, allowing him to eventually marry Miss Winters once an appropriate interval had passed, without the stain of having driven his first wife to divorce through his adultery. Edmund had been silent for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of what was being offered. Then he had asked, and here Alexander's expression grew particularly grim, what Alexander's interest was in securing my freedom, and what he intended to do with it once obtained. Alexander had responded with complete honesty. He intended to marry me himself, the moment it became legally possible to do so. His interest in the matter was therefore not altruistic, but entirely selfish. He wanted me free so that he could claim me properly, without the scandal of an affair or the legal complications of a wife who remained married to another man. The admission had apparently shocked Edmund into a moment of genuine emotion. He had asked, and Alexander reported this with a mixture of satisfaction and contempt, whether I had been conducting an affair with Alexander throughout our marriage. Had his wife been unfaithful while condemning him for the same? Alexander's response had been swift and unequivocal. I had been absolutely faithful to my marriage vows, regardless of how poorly Edmund had honored his own. There had been no affair, no impropriety, nothing beyond friendship carefully maintained within the bounds of propriety. But Alexander had continued with cold precision. If Edmund wished to claim that I was somehow at fault for the failure of their marriage, then they could certainly pursue that argument in court, where Edmund's own documented adultery would be laid bare for all of society to examine. The threat had been clear, and Edmund, whatever his other faults, was not stupid enough to miss it. He had no moral high ground to claim, no legitimate grievance to pursue. His choices were simple: accept the annulment, with its generous terms, and go on to marry the woman he actually wanted, or fight it and face the consequences of having all his transgressions made public in the most humiliating way possible. Edmund had chosen pragmatism over pride. He had agreed to the annulment, to the settlement terms, to all of it. His only condition, and here I felt a flash of genuine anger despite my overall relief, was that the annulment be processed as quickly as possible, as he was eager to be free to pursue his relationship with Miss Winters without the inconvenience of a wife. The casual cruelty of reducing our marriage to an inconvenience should have wounded me. Instead, I felt only gratitude that he was making this easy, that his desire to be rid of me aligned so perfectly with my own desire for freedom. Alexander's solicitors, he continued, were already preparing the necessary documents. With both parties in agreement and the evidence of incompatibility well established, they anticipated the annulment could be finalized within 3 to 4 months, remarkably swift for such proceedings. I would need to provide some testimony, but it could be done privately before church officials rather than in open court, sparing me the worst of the public scrutiny. The settlement Edmund had agreed to was indeed generous. I would retain my dowry in full, receive an additional monetary settlement that would provide comfortable independence, and be allowed to remove any personal property I wished from the Ashford residences. In return, I would make no claims against Edmund's estate or fortune, and would agree to maintain discretion regarding the circumstances of our separation. It was, Alexander concluded, the best possible outcome given the constraints we faced. There would still be scandal. Dissolving a marriage always provoked gossip, regardless of how it was accomplished. But the scandal would be manageable, survivable, and most importantly, temporary. Within a year, perhaps 2, the ton would have moved on to fresher sources of gossip, and my marriage to Alexander, for we would marry the moment the law allowed, would gradually eclipse the memory of my failed first union. I sat in stunned silence, absorbing the magnitude of what Alexander had accomplished. In the space of 3 days, he had transformed what I had believed to be an impossible situation into a clear path forward. He had negotiated my freedom with intelligence and efficiency, protecting my interests and my reputation, while securing the future we both wanted. When I finally found my voice, I asked him why he had gone to such extraordinary lengths, why he had invested so much time and effort, and undoubtedly significant sums of money, into freeing me from a marriage that was not his concern. His response was simple, direct, and utterly devastating in its sincerity. He told me that I had always been his concern, from the moment we met, that watching me trapped in an unhappy marriage while he had the means to help had been unbearable, that he loved me with an intensity that made every other consideration irrelevant, that he would have done far more, risked far more, sacrificed far more, if it meant securing my happiness and my freedom. And then, propriety be damned, Agnes's presence in the corner be damned, all the careful restraint we had maintained for months be damned, he crossed the distance between us, took my hands in his, and asked me properly to marry him. Not at some distant point in the future, not as a vague possibility once the annulment was finalized, but as a definite intention. The moment I was legally free, would I do him the extraordinary honor of becoming his wife? The tears I had been holding back for weeks finally spilled over, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. I told him yes. Yes to marriage. Yes to a future together. Yes to choosing love over security and happiness over social expectation, and my own desires over the crushing weight of what others believed I should want. He kissed my hands, a gesture that was both chaste and charged with promise of everything that would come later, when we no longer had to maintain this agonizing distance. And then, because he was Alexander, and propriety mattered even in the midst of emotional upheaval, he released me and stepped back to a more appropriate distance, though his eyes held promises that made my breath catch in my throat. The impossible had become possible. The future I had not dared dream of was suddenly miraculously within reach. All that remained was to navigate the next few months of legal proceedings, to endure the inevitable scandal and gossip, and to wait for the day when I would finally be free to claim the happiness that had always been meant to be mine. The weeks that followed were strange, simultaneously exhilarating and anxious, filled with hope and shadowed by the practical realities of dissolving a marriage. Edmund moved his belongings from our shared home within days of agreeing to the annulment, taking up residence in his bachelor apartments without ceremony or farewell. His departure was so complete, so absolute, that it felt less like the end of a marriage, and more like the removal of furniture one had never particularly liked in the first place. I began the process of establishing my own household, separate from both Edmund's control and my family's authority. With the settlement Alexander had negotiated, I could afford a small but respectable residence in a decent part of London, a statement of independence that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in my life, I would be beholden to no man, dependent on no one's goodwill, free to make my own choices and live with the consequences. The scandal, as predicted, was considerable. Ladies who had previously greeted me with warmth now looked through me as though I were invisible. Social invitations dwindled to a trickle from only the most progressive or supportive of my acquaintances. I heard the whispers, saw the judgment in their eyes, felt the weight of their disapproval every time I ventured into public. But I also experienced something unexpected, a growing circle of support from women who understood, who had perhaps endured their own unhappy marriages, or watched friends suffer in similar circumstances, who quietly approved of my choice even if they could not openly support it without risking their own social positions. And through it all, Alexander remained constant, a steady presence that anchored me when the waves of social censure threatened to overwhelm. He made it clear to anyone who would listen that his intentions toward me were entirely honorable, that we would marry the moment the law allowed, that anyone who wished to maintain his goodwill would treat me with respect, regardless of their private opinions about my annulment. His position as a duke, his social power, his willingness to use both in my defense. These things could not entirely shield me from scandal, but they blunted its worst effects. And they sent a clear message to society. Catherine Ashford might have ended her marriage, but she had not fallen from grace. She had, instead, been claimed by someone of even greater consequence than the man she had left. 3 months after Edmund agreed to the annulment, the church officials concluded their review and granted the dissolution of our marriage. I was, in the eyes of law and society, no longer Mrs. Edmund Ashford. I was simply Catherine, a woman whose first marriage had been declared invalid, free to remarry if she so chose, and I most definitely so chose. The morning of my wedding to Alexander Thornton dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect June days when the English countryside seems determined to prove that it can rival any Mediterranean paradise for sheer beauty. I woke early in my chamber at Greystone Abbey, where I had arrived 2 days prior to prepare for the ceremony, and allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection before the day's festivities began. 6 months had passed since the annulment was finalized. 6 months during which Alexander and I had courted properly, publicly, with all the ceremony that society demanded. We had attended the same functions, danced together openly, made our intentions clear to anyone who cared to observe, and gradually, miraculously, the scandal had begun to fade. It helped that Edmund had married Miss Winters in a quiet ceremony just 3 months after our annulment was granted, proving that his attachment to her had been genuine, even if his methods of pursuing it had been reprehensible. Society, always eager for happy endings, had decided that perhaps the entire situation had worked out for the best. 2 marriages that should never have been, dissolved, so that the correct pairings could finally occur. The narrative was overly simplified, of course, and glossed over the very real pain and difficulty of the preceding months. But I had learned that society preferred neat stories to messy truths, and if they wished to believe that everything had happened according to some grand romantic plan, I was content to let them think so. Agnes entered my chamber with morning chocolate and the news that the household was already abuzz with preparations. The chapel had been decorated with white roses and trailing ivy. The breakfast following the ceremony was prepared and awaiting only the appropriate moment to be served, and the small group of guests who would witness our union had begun to arrive. Small was the operative word. Alexander and I had agreed that we wanted an intimate ceremony, attended only by those who genuinely supported our union. No more than 30 people would be present, and each had been carefully selected for their genuine affection rather than their social consequence. My mother had declined to attend, unable to reconcile herself to my choice to end my first marriage, but my younger sister Caroline had come, defying maternal disapproval to stand beside me on this most important day. As Agnes helped me dress, I found myself thinking about the girl I had been 3 years ago, preparing for my first wedding to Edmund, that Catherine had been so certain she was making the wise choice, selecting security over passion, choosing the safe path because the alternative seemed too intense, too overwhelming, too likely to consume her entirely. She had been wrong about so many things. Love was overwhelming, was consuming, was intense enough to shake the foundations of everything one believed about themselves and the world. But rather than destroying me, as I had once feared, that intensity had rebuilt me into someone stronger, braver, more authentically myself than I had ever been while trying to fit into the mold of what I thought I should want. My wedding gown was silk the color of champagne, not the pure white of a first marriage, but something softer, warmer, more suited to a woman who had learned that life was rarely as simple as black and white, right and wrong, proper and improper. The modiste had outdone herself, creating a dress that was both elegant and romantic, with delicate lace at the sleeves and neckline that suggested innocence while acknowledging experience. Caroline arrived as Agnes was putting the finishing touches on my hair, and my sister's eyes filled with tears the moment she saw me. She told me I looked beautiful, that she was so proud of me for having the courage to choose my own happiness, that she hoped when her own time came to marry, she would be as brave as I had been. The praise felt unearned. I had not felt brave throughout most of this process, merely desperate and terrified and clinging to Alexander's steady presence like a drowning woman to a lifeline. But perhaps courage was not the absence of fear, but rather the decision to act despite it, in which case, perhaps I had been brave after all. The walk from the abbey to the chapel was short, but I took my time, wanting to savor these final moments of anticipation before everything changed irrevocably. Caroline walked beside me, having agreed to stand as my attendant in lieu of the traditional father-giving-away ritual. My father had passed away years before, and given my mother's disapproval, it seemed more appropriate to have my sister's support than to ask some distant male relative to perform the ceremonial transfer of authority over me from one man to another. The chapel was small but exquisite, built in the 14th century, and maintained with obvious care over the generations. Light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the stone floor and the gathered guests, who rose as I entered, but I barely noticed them. My entire focus had narrowed to the man standing at the altar, watching my approach with such intensity that it felt like a physical touch across the distance between us. Alexander wore formal attire in shades of gray and black that complemented his dark coloring, but it was not his clothing that captured my attention. It was his expression, the mixture of love and relief and barely restrained emotion that suggested he had been as anxious as I about this moment finally arriving, as though he too had feared that something might intervene at the last moment to prevent us from claiming this happiness we had fought so hard to secure. I walked down the aisle with my head held high, no longer the naive girl who had made this journey once before, but a woman who understood exactly what she was choosing and why. And when I reached Alexander's side and placed my hand in his, I felt a rightness that I had never experienced during my first wedding, a sense of pieces finally fitting together in the way they always should have. The ceremony itself was traditional, the words familiar from countless weddings I had attended over the years, but speaking them to Alexander transformed them from ritual to revelation. When I promised to love and honor him, I meant it with every fiber of my being. When he vowed to cherish and protect me, I heard the truth of it in his voice, saw it reflected in his eyes. And when the vicar finally pronounced us husband and wife, when Alexander was given permission to kiss his bride, the contact between us was electric despite its brevity and propriety. It was a promise of everything that would come later, when we were finally alone, and all the restrictions of courtship and propriety could be set aside in favor of the passion we had restrained for so long. The breakfast following the ceremony was a joyous affair, filled with genuine celebration from people who truly cared about our happiness. Alexander's closest friends made speeches that were both heartfelt and amusing. Caroline cried happy tears throughout most of the meal, and even the few society members who had been invited seemed caught up in the romance of the occasion, rather than dwelling on the scandal that had preceded it. But the moment I had been truly anticipating came later, as the afternoon faded into evening and the guests began to depart. Alexander and I stood at the entrance to the abbey, bidding farewell to the last of the well-wishers, and then, finally, miraculously, we were alone. He took my hand and led me through the abbey's corridors, pointing out family portraits and architectural features as though giving me a tour, though we both knew this was merely a way of prolonging the anticipation building between us. Eventually, we arrived at the ducal apartments. Our apartments now, I reminded myself with a thrill of possessiveness, and Alexander closed the door behind us with a finality that made my heart race. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, and I saw reflected in his eyes the same mixture of desire and nervousness that I felt. We had waited so long for this, had endured so much to reach this moment, that it felt almost surreal to finally be here, married and alone and free to express everything we had been holding back. Alexander moved toward me slowly, giving me time to object or retreat, but I met him halfway, done with restraint, done with propriety, done with all the barriers that had kept us apart. When his hands cupped my face and his lips met mine, it was nothing like the chaste kiss we had shared in the chapel. This was consuming, overwhelming, exactly the intensity I had once feared and now welcomed with my entire being. We made our way to the bedroom. I have only fragmentary memories of that journey, too focused on Alexander's touch and taste, and the way he whispered my name like a prayer against my skin. And when we finally came together, when the last barriers between us were removed, and we claimed each other completely, I understood at last what physical intimacy was meant to be, when joined with genuine love and respect and soul-deep connection. Edmund had made me believe that marital relations were merely duty to be endured. Alexander showed me they could be transcendent when shared with someone who actually loved you, who took pleasure in your pleasure, who treated you as a partner rather than a possession. Later, as we lay tangled together in the darkness with moonlight streaming through the windows, Alexander traced lazy patterns on my shoulder and spoke softly about our future. We would remain at Greystone for several weeks, he said, giving society time to adjust to our marriage before returning to London. We would travel. He wanted to show me Scotland, where he had spent those years away from England, and perhaps the continent, once the political situation stabilized. We would fill the abbey with children, if we were so blessed, creating a family built on love rather than obligation. But more than any specific plans, he promised me something far more precious, that I would never again have to hide who I was, never again have to pretend that my thoughts and feelings and desires were unimportant, that I would be his partner in all things, valued and cherished and respected, for all the days of our lives. The promise moved me to tears, happy tears this time, the kind that came from overwhelming gratitude rather than sorrow. I told him that he had saved me, that his love had pulled me back from the edge of becoming a ghost in my own life, that I could never adequately express what his faith in me had meant during those dark months of my first marriage. But Alexander shook his head, his expression serious despite the tenderness in his touch. He told me that I had saved myself, that the decision to leave Edmund, to risk scandal and social ruin in pursuit of genuine happiness, had been mine alone to make. He had simply provided support and resources, but the courage required to take that step had come from within me. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps courage had been there all along, waiting for circumstances desperate enough to call it forth. Or perhaps love itself was the source of courage, the realization that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to claim. The weeks at Greystone passed in a haze of happiness that I had not known was possible. We rode together through the estate's extensive grounds, explored the library's impressive collection, spent long evenings in conversation about everything and nothing. Alexander introduced me to his tenants and estate workers, making it clear that I was to be an active participant in managing Greystone, rather than merely a decorative duchess confined to the drawing room. I began to write again, not secretly, hidden away as though it were something shameful, but openly, with Alexander's full encouragement and support. The poetry I had suppressed during my marriage to Edmund flowed freely once more, and Alexander would sometimes read my work and offer thoughtful commentary that showed he genuinely valued my artistic efforts. This was what marriage should be, I realized. Not one person subsuming their identity into another's, but two complete individuals choosing to build a life together while maintaining their own passions and pursuits. Edmund had wanted a wife who would be an extension of himself, with no thoughts or desires independent of his own. Alexander wanted a partner, someone who challenged and inspired him as much as he challenged and inspired her. When we finally returned to London at the end of summer, I found that society's attitude toward me had shifted in subtle but significant ways. I was no longer the scandalous Mrs. Ashford who had ended her marriage, but rather the Duchess of Greystone, a woman of consequence whose past difficulties were gradually being reframed as romantic obstacles overcome rather than shameful failures to be condemned. It helped that Alexander made his devotion abundantly clear, that we were obviously deeply in love in a way that even the most cynical observers could not dismiss. It helped, too, that Edmund and the former Miss Winters appeared reasonably content in their own union, suggesting that all parties had ended up better matched than in the original configuration. But more than any external validation, what mattered was the peace I felt within myself. I had made a terrible mistake in my first marriage, had allowed fear and pressure and my own cowardice to lead me away from what my heart knew was right. But I had also found the strength to correct that mistake, to choose again with greater wisdom and courage, to claim the happiness I deserved despite the cost. On a crisp October morning nearly a year after our wedding, I stood in the Greystone gardens watching Alexander play with the estate dogs, and I felt a wave of gratitude so profound it was almost painful. Gratitude for Alexander's patient love, for the annulment that had freed me from an impossible situation, for my own courage in choosing to leave rather than endure. But most of all, I felt gratitude for the whispered words on a moonlit terrace that had changed everything. You were always mine, Catherine, and I was always yours, because he had been right. Despite marriage to another man, despite years of separation, despite all my efforts to convince myself otherwise, I had always been his, and he had always been mine. Our souls had recognized each other from the beginning, had remained connected even when circumstances forced us apart, had found their way back to each other despite every obstacle. Alexander looked up from the dogs and caught me watching him, and the smile that transformed his face was everything I needed to know about the rightness of our union. He crossed the garden with long strides and pulled me into his arms with the casual affection of a man secure in his wife's love, and I leaned into his embrace with the certainty of a woman who had finally found home. We had taken the long way around, had endured pain and scandal and heartbreak to reach this point. But standing there in Alexander's arms with the autumn sunlight warm on my face and our entire future stretching before us, I understood that every moment of difficulty had been worth it. I had entered my first marriage as a girl seeking security and had discovered that safety without love was merely a beautiful prison. I had entered my second marriage as a woman who understood that true security came not from social position or wealth, but from being truly known and truly loved by someone who valued every part of you. And as Alexander kissed me there in the gardens of Greystone, with no one watching and nothing to prove, I knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged, with the man who had whispered the truth that set me free, with the Duke who had always been mine, in a love story that had finally found its proper ending. Or rather, not an ending at all, but a beginning, the first chapter of a life we would write together, filled with all the passion and partnership and genuine happiness that I had once believed existed only in novels. I had learned that truth was indeed more fascinating than fiction, that real love required courage and sacrifice, and the willingness to risk everything for something that mattered. And I had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love was choosing yourself, trusting that you were worth fighting for, believing that your happiness mattered as much as anyone else's. These were lessons hard won and dearly bought, but standing in Alexander's arms with our future bright before us, I would not have traded them for anything, because they had brought me here, to this moment, to this man, to this life that was finally, truly, authentically mine. I was Catherine Thornton, Duchess of Greystone, no longer trapped or hidden or diminished, but fully myself in all my complexity and contradiction and strength. And I was loved, deeply and completely, by a man who had waited years for the chance to claim me, who had fought beside me through scandal and difficulty, who had never once doubted that I was worth every moment of the wait. The whisper on the terrace had been right. I was always his, and he was always mine. And that truth, that beautiful, powerful, transformative truth, had been worth every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of fear and uncertainty it had taken to claim it. This was happiness. This was love. This was, at long last, home.